I had Lance on the brain because he was helping Rachel and I out because once again there were some technical issues this morning with the printer, and so it had not printed all of those handouts. So if you didn't get one of this morning's handouts, Rachel is finishing up some extra ones, so we should all have them. And again, it's an important resource, and it also helps our time sake because I can then not worry about the fact that the print may be too small on the screen on some of these to read, and I did want you to have a copy of them. So last week we talked about, we began the section on what did the early church believe about salvation. And so we look at that second century church and we see what they believed and everything. And what was the big surprise, not so much to us, but to denominational scholars that start studying this issue in the early church. They saw very clearly, just as we saw last week, that the early church definitely saw salvation as something that did require some response on man's part and not just solo fidelis faith only. So we talked about Martin Luther. We'll come back to him a little bit some this morning. But this was the conclusion that we stopped with last week, that salvation begins and ends with grace, but in the middle is man's faithful and obedient response. So we looked at those scriptures and we looked at the writings of the very early church, which showed that they did believe that. So there was a group that did exist in the first and second century that did preach salvation by grace alone. So we established last week that was not the early church per se. So who was it in those early centuries that was preaching this? Anybody got a guess? Nope, the Jewish converts simply wanted them to convert to Judaism before they became members of the church. So they still thought you had to obey the plan of salvation. They just thought you also had to become a proselyte. Let's try and help you with this. So this group was, of course, labeled as heretics by the early Christians. This group strongly disputed the church's stance on salvation and works. Instead, they taught that man is totally depraved, that we are saved solely by grace, that works played no role in our salvation, and that we cannot lose our salvation once we obtain it. Does that sound kind of familiar to anybody?
Calvinism?
Yeah. That is very much the 5 essential doctrines of Calvinism. And of course, Calvinism has only been around 2 or 3 centuries and not going back 2,000 plus years. So it may be interesting to recognize that Calvin did not crack a new egg, if you will, when he talked about his point. As we see time and time again, and as we are clearly taught in the Bible, there is nothing new under the sun. So right away, there were heretical groups that sprang up, and there was a group whose basic stances on the issues, and that's what we're covering there. Remind one very much of Calvinism. So if you remember your tulip, that is total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. So, all that having been said, who is it that we're actually talking about here?
Gnostics.
It is the Gnostics. I knew you'd get that bonus. That's why I didn't offer cash this morning. Oh, see, you guys. I thought I could trust y'all. You see how they do now? So let's start with just a quick recap, because I know Scott has talked about the Gnostics a lot. I'm not interested in a class on the Gnostics itself. What I want you to see, though, is how they got there. You know, what led the Gnostics to arrive at very similar positions to basic Calvinism. So, what did they teach?
You have some special knowledge.
Okay. The word Gnostic, you might remember, comes from the Greek word for knowledge. So the claim to fame, and I mean that quite literally, of the Gnostics was that they knew better than everybody else in the church at that time. They had been given a deeper revelation, and you know there's so many of them with such a great variety of individual doctrines. And one thing you can mark, because we're going to get into, you know, the ability to identify the Lord's church today. So that's coming in a future lesson. So it's interesting to note that with heresies, one of the things that quickly develops is there are 1,000 versions of it. And I think that is very telling. Why does a heretical position seem to wind up with all these private interpretations? Okay. And in my next question, I am going to refer to it as human wisdom theology. But I'm looking up for how do you be a Christian and yet belong to a group that believes these things, and yet within the group there are 1,000, you know, it's Heinz 57 flavors. You know. But you still see this same thing today. And that's why it's important for us to learn this lesson. And you know,
the will of yourself.
Okay.
Not the will of the Father.
I was going to say you're right in there.
I believe a certain way to fit into my lifestyle.
Yeah. Once you have developed a heretical position, you did not get there with accurate interpretation of God's Word, because obviously what God intended is not heresy. And we all agree on that. If God intended it, whether 5 people believe it, 5 billion or 500 billion, is irrelevant in and of itself. If it is what God's intended message is, then that is the correct position. That's the correct doctrine. So if you don't arrive God's meaning, that means somewhere the way you interpret Scripture has a flaw in it. And as we all know, as we talk about with ourselves all the time, we do have individual blind spots and everything that we need to become aware of and strive to overcome and be objective in our own study of God's Word. That's required of every Bible student. But you will see with the heretical groups right up to today that since it's a flawed method of interpreting the Bible that got them there, then once you're using a flawed method, your own desires and come into play, and you can prove anything if you don't have to follow sound rules of biblical interpretation. And so these groups always wind up with a vast variety of different individual doctrines. One reason why these groups seldom have big congregations, right up to right now, these type of groups, is because they have a flawed hermeneutic, and therefore they're constantly splitting among themselves. So if you get 25 of them, then 10 of them have decided that now you're wrong about this. And so they split off, start their own little group. So, I've seen these type of groups in places like in Arkansas, where I spent so much time because of the mother's family and everything. And I mean, they're everywhere, and there's like anywhere from 5 to 15 of them in each little group. Because they've been around for a while, and they keep splitting and saying, oh no, you're wrong about this, and start another one, another one. And I'm afraid sometimes we try and emulate that pattern, which is why I do talk so much about properly interpreting the Bible, because that is the only way to actually have unity. Remember the math test example. If you want everybody to have the same answer, other than copying one another, then you need to have taught them the correct way to work the problem, because it's the right answer that will have an educated group giving that for their answer, because they've been taught correctly. As far as wrong answers go on a math problem, when that teacher gets that test, one particular question, she might have 30 different wrong answers. Because if you're doing it wrong, you know, there's no telling where you will wind up. Is that making any sense? Yeah. So, didn't sleep last night, so my rapport is not what I would like it to be. So, basically, within their little individual branches over and over, they began with the premise that the God who created the world and God the Father who gave us Jesus are two completely different gods. And see, once you get that premise, then immediately you've got all kinds of possibilities opened up. Anything that you don't like, well, that's this God, and he's wrong. Anything that you like, well, that's the other God, he's right. And, you know, you can literally from there create any doctrine that suits your own desires. You know? So they claim this special deeper knowledge, this deeper revelation, which of course in and of itself is a clear violation of the apostolic teaching. Then they taught that the God of the Old Testament was this bad God. They, in their writings, usually speak of him as being a flawed God, which is an interesting concept. But so a flawed God cannot do anything without it being what? Flawed. So the world is the way it is because he wasn't really good at being God or a God, you know. And because he created a flawed world, then men are born totally depraved because they've come into a physical existence in a flawed world. They have to be inherently flawed themselves. Okay? So, flawed God, bad creation, bad human beings created by him. And then when you get to the New Testament, you can set all the warnings of the Old Testament aside because the New Testament is actually God the Father. And again, I'm trying to use language that they tended to use in their writings. So the correct God, if you will, is God the Father. And then this lesser flawed God was in the Old Testament, but the New Testament is from the good God. And he gave us Jesus and everything. But, and this is a real important part of their teaching, because it's a flawed world created by a flawed God, Jesus could not actually have been a man because he would have taken on a flawed disposition. You know, because nothing that's of this world could be perfect. You know. So they taught that Jesus really wasn't a man. He just, you know, came in a spirit form that he made look like a man. Therefore, he never really suffered. He never really died. He never really was resurrected because he never really died. You see how that snowball just gets bigger and bigger and bigger? And then, they, like I said, they made their own flavors up from there. But that is why, if you use the word Gnostic, depending on where you look for a reference, it might describe the guy that I always say is the one naked at the top of a flagpole in a blizzard. You know, because the flesh is flawed, and so you punish the flesh is where that particular ideology leads you. At the same time, more popular than that group, I wonder why, were those who taught that since the flesh is inherently flawed, anything you do in the flesh does not actually matter. It's only things that you do in the spirit. So you can fornicate, lie, cheat, steal, all you want to. It's not a problem because it belongs to the flawed world, you know. And that was the main reason it got so popular so quickly, is that type of reasoning. You know. But you had within that, you had a lot of self-created codes that were doctrine to them. You know, so some guy said you have to do this, and you have to eat that, and you have to wear this, you know, or not wear anything, etc., etc. Patty, did you have a comment?
No, I was just going to say, why do you go to church?
Well,
I mean, what's the purpose?
I'll get there in just a second, I think. So, what was the result of this type of human wisdom theology?
Messed up world.
Yeah. When you start going by human wisdom instead of God wisdom, you are definitely messed up. And so anybody that says they know something beyond what God teaches in His Word, you should be able to mark immediately as a false teacher. You may not know his or her motives, but you know that they're teaching a false doctrine. So that's where the will worship gene and all of that type of stuff comes in. So how do we know? You got to be fair when you do this, right? How do we know that the Gnostics were wrong? When you don't name the groups and you start in on this, you get a lot of people influenced by denominational Calvinism today saying, hey, this group, the one that, says we're saved by grace only and everything, they're the true church, and the rest of the church that declared them heretics, is the group that's wrong here. So how do we know that these Gnostics were wrong? Again, the measuring is not what I think or what I believe or what I want to believe. The measuring stick is what has God said in His special revelation. Never forget that the only special revelation or specific is a good term to use for it as well, that exists is the Bible. So whether you're looking at Apocrypha or commentaries or listening to one of my sermons or Bible classes, it doesn't matter. That those are not the test. The test is what has God said in His specific revelation, the Bible.
When they come up against this, well, this is flawed or something, we didn't interpret this right, or something. When they can't attack us any other way, they say the Bible itself is flawed.
Yep. You should always immediately be concerned when a person you're trying to have a conversation with or study with is able to reject the Bible out of hand whenever it disagrees with them. But we're going to get to some of these things. We just got to move along. So going back, Patty, to your question, why or how could someone get God's message so wrong?
In defense of it, they didn't have the Timothy letter. They didn't have the letters. They had the apostles, and they had the apostles' doctrine, and they had what was going on at that time, but they didn't have a compiled book that they could go to. They didn't know to go and to study to show thyself approved unto God.
Were they literate at that time? Did they read if there was a Bible?
There was a lot of illiterateness. That is why the Bible, the New Testament, refers often to the reader of the church. Everybody familiar with that? So every congregation had a reader who was someone that was literate and could read well and could speak loud. I've always told people that want to comment in my class, if they're not being loud enough, I may not want to use them regardless of how well they can read, because if the class as a whole can't hear you read it, you're not benefiting us. So if the church, without benefit of a PA system, cannot hear you, then it doesn't matter what a great reader you are, because the purpose of that position is to be able to read. Now, they had these letters. That's how these letters came into be the canon that we call the Bible as a whole. They did not have the ease which we had, and some of them were illiterate, churches were almost always a mixed bag. What you have to realize when we talk about so much of the early church being Gentile and then so much of the Gentile being slaves, we tend to let our own history as a country with slavery tell us what that means. But the average slave in the Roman world, many of them were highly educated people because a teacher was usually a slave. So if you're a wealthy Roman and you've got children that you want to educate, you hired a guy. And those slaves had some of the best lives around back then because they were allowed to receive money for their services, etc. And so, but then of course you always had the basic just manual workers that had never been taught and things like that. So it's usually a mixed bag in the early church anywhere you went. But I think overall they were much more literate than the average person today seems to think of them. And I think that slave or bondservant, however you want to read that, it simply means slave, as we've talked about. But not understanding exactly what that was. That was one of the main reasons why the Roman world was so full. You know, we've talked before about how greatly they outnumbered the Romans and everything. That there were that many because instead of private businesses so much with a wealthy owner and being run by slaves that were manual labor, you had all these skilled workers. Think of a corporation today. Has all of us workers, but how many times have we said you can compare our jobs today somewhat to the slavery of that era? So when he talks about slaves treating their masters right, you know, the application for us would be, you know, doing right by our bosses, etc. and everything. So they had those. Most of all, remember the timeline here. So before they have them, what do they have? That's true. What's that, Tony?
The oral teaching.
The oral teachings? Yeah. In a society where there are a good number of illiterates in that day, they learned by memory, recitation, oral teaching. And that's why they were so much better listeners than we are, you know, because that was their form of reading. That was their form of gaining knowledge. So they had the oral teaching. Where did that teaching come from?
The scrolls and things like that.
That's true too, but catalog that under the Old Testament. The apostles. So before they have the complete Bible, that is why they have living, breathing apostles to tell them what God says on the subject. And that is why they also had, in addition to that, people that had the miraculous gift of teaching. I've often wished that still existed. But, you know, there were those given the miraculous gift of wisdom, of teaching, you know, which pretty much the same thing. But it means accurate knowledge of God's will. And so in the period when they don't have the scriptures per se, they've got the living apostles, they've got these people with miraculous gifts, and as the collection of the scriptures and the accessibility of them increases, those numbers start decreasing. Remember when we talked about that? So they've got that.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
If they're doing a lot of oral teaching, which would probably, in some cases, leave room for a lot of error, right?
No,
No, they go, who's?
but that's because of the difference.
The apostles aren't going house to house with every people.
No.
So there had to be oral, if there was a lot.
I'm not saying there's not oral teaching. I'm saying it's not all flawed the way when we play the game gossip and stuff, because they had trained memories and they had trained ears. So everybody in that society could quote long anything, not just scriptures or anything like that. And again, there is a balance here. So to go back to the question itself, so how could someone get God's message so wrong? It's a variety of things. It's usually a combination of things in any individual application you want to make of this. The main thing I want to tell you is to, one, beware of these type motivations, and two, beware of judging someone's motivations and their false teaching, because you don't know. As I said, today the majority of false teachers have good intentions. You know, they're not inherently wicked people just trying to send souls to hell, etc. They're people who, for some of these reasons we're going to discuss briefly, they're people who then simply allowed their motives to overcome sound reasoning. And I just don't know what more to tell you about that motive, because I mean, we all see this every day in ourselves and in those around us, and people's ability to believe the wildest things just because they want to believe it. And no one's exempt from that. That's, like I said, that's one of those motives, things that you have to know your own, and then let that be a caution to you to try and be objective. But whether it's pride, which is often a major driving force, because if I'm saying that I have special revelation that God didn't give to anybody else, what am I really saying?
But you're bigger than God.
I'm special, you know. You guys, you're just ordinary. But I'm special because God gave me some specific revelation beyond what He's given y'all. And so I'm saying I'm special. That's our ego, our desire to be loved, to have people look up at us. That is pride, just on and on down the line, you know. And then, of course, there is always a greed factor, because for most of these Gnostics, just like most false teachers today, if you want to get that special knowledge, which is in my book, insert title here, then send your donation of $25 and I will mail you the book, you know. So greed is often involved in it as well. Just always remember, when God says the heart is deceitfully wicked, who can trust it? That is a great warning that God has given us to say, hey, you will tend to believe things that aren't logical because you desperately want to believe them. And when I talk about the examples all around us, I see parents and grandparents with children and grandchildren. You know, when hate public recordings. I'll just say that I have personally observed this many times, and sometimes, you know, to great tragedy. But when you want to believe something, the whole thing about God so clearly saying these essential things you have to do, so man's obedient response. Why does everybody want to reject that? And warning, the older you get, the more the tendency is to want to reject that. It's because the older you get, the more people you know and love and care about and think are great people that have not done that. And you don't want to believe that anyone like that could be lost. And when it's your own children or your own grandchildren or whatever the case, your dear departed sweet grandmother, you know, etc., our minds are constantly seeking rationalizations that will allow us to believe that there is a reason for hope when there is absolutely no reason for hope for that person.
Well, how much of that influence comes from Satan, including the agnostics?
Well,
I mean, Satan had to play in a lot of perversion of the word.
Satan is the one that helps us find these rationalizations. All right, so I didn't get as far as I wanted, but you see this this screen, because I wasn't going to go through this whole screen anyway. So it's in your handout. I recommend. I laughed a couple weeks back because I saw that in my original notes back in the introduction, I said I would ask y'all to do homework every week. And then, of course, I backed off that because, you know, I wanted to live. And I'm going to give you homework and say, read those passages. Because when you read them, you will see that there is God's clear, simple word that contradicts everything these Gnostics were teaching and saying. Yeah. So that's a good list. Man, I love all of it, but that last one, especially 2 Peter chapter 2, that's a great one, because that whole chapter describes these type of situations. And one I didn't put on there, but Monty, you had for us, John, 2 John?
2 John 1:7.
2 John 1:7, where he is talking about the Gnostics as being those who deny that Jesus came in the flesh. You see?
I thought of that too.
Yeah.
There's a couple verses later on that talk about stuff.
Absolutely. I find that interesting enough. The whole Bible is related. If you read it. All right, class dismissed.
Hey, Chris, one announcement is I'll be starting teaching class next week.